ban all mobile phones at school for year 5-9? Sure. Just expect us to find a way around this. Obligatory long time reader, first time poster, and sorry for the long story. TLDR at the bottom. So, 3 years ago, when I was in year 9, my school banned mobile phones for every student from year 5 to year 9. This meant that the students in year 10-12 were still allowed to use them. The exact wording was mobile phones are prohibited for years 5-9 during school hours on school grounds. My class was a bit pissed off by this. We didn't really understand why they did it. The school's reasoning was that the students didn't play with each other enough, because we didn't really use our phones that much in the first place. Also, they made this rule in the middle of the year, so we felt that it was just unnecessary that we couldn't use our phones for just half a year. We weren't the only ones to be unhappy, though. Usually, a rule like this had to be discussed by the student council, the teacher council and the parent council, not sure if those are the right words, I'm translating from German. And then had to be discussed by the school assembly, where people from all 3 councils were present. This rule, however, had been made by the principal and vice principal, without asking anyone. They were also really strict with that rule. Everyone who was seen with a phone was supposed to get detention. After the long introductions, let's start with the story. Our class was really petty, so we immediately knew we wanted to do something about this. Also, in our school, the different years were really close-knit. Everyone had connections to everyone, especially in cases like this. So we knew that if we did something, the younger students would follow our example. First, we did the obvious thing. We didn't take out our phones during school hours. Oh, you want us to do a class project where we have to do research? No problem, but we have to go to the computer room. We don't have any phones with us. Our school had 3 computer rooms for approximately 1,000 students, so you can imagine that didn't work very well. That also meant that every time someone had to call their parents, they had to go to the secretary, who had 2 phones. On normal school days, this wasn't as big of a problem, but on days where school ended early because of the head or a strong wind, that meant that every single student from year 5-9 had to use these phones. Our school had the rule that year 5-9 aren't allowed to leave the school ground unless they have their parents' permission. On days like that, the secretary barely got any work done, since she needed to use the phone as well. After that, we started to get creative. The rule said on school grounds, right? Our school had stairs running down from the school ground to a street. The first step belonged to the school, the second didn't anymore. Usually, these steps were used by all the smoking students, since there was a rule prohibiting smoking on school grounds, but suddenly the first step was full of students using their phones. We sat on the first step, our arms stretched out so they were over the second step. Our teachers were amused by this. They hadn't seen the need for the rule either, but our principal and vice principal weren't happy. Once the younger students started to use this trick as well, we moved on. The rule said for years 5-9, right? Year 9 and year 10 were really close. There were a lot of friend groups between them. So we hung out with them, using our phones, and every time a teacher came near, we gave all our phones to the older students. That meant that sometimes one student would have 6-10 phones with them, but the rule said nothing against that. Again, our teachers knew what we were doing and let us do our thing, but the principal and vice principal were pissed. But they couldn't really do anything. Not all of the younger students were able to follow our example with this, because they simply didn't have that many friends with students in year 10 and up, so we came up with the third plan. The rule explicitly said mobile phones. This one was almost the easiest. We brought almost every device that wasn't a mobile phone that we could find. We started with MP3 players, tablets and those really fancy calculators you can play games on. After that, we brought our Nintendos. Everyone in our class had one. We played on them every break, and once the other students had seen us doing that, they started doing that as well. Because we almost always played Mario Kart, and you could only play with 8 players in one round, everyone just played with the people that stood closest to them, regardless of age, gender, or if they even knew each other. We really made a lot of friends this way. Because of this, almost all the students at our school played on their consoles, so the rule made happen what it was supposed to prevent. Our principal and vice principal were really angry at this point, but they couldn't do anything. They suspected that our class had come up with all those things, but they couldn't prove anything. They couldn't punish us, either. A lot of times they tried to take away our consoles, but our parents always told them that the rule didn't say anything against them. When they tried to change the rule, the school assembly argued that they weren't asked when the rule was established in the first place. But they would make a lot of trouble if it was changed without their input. And surprisingly, they didn't agree to a change. Meanwhile, the school year had ended. In the new year, our class was allowed to use their phones, so we stopped our pettiness. But it had already been started, so the younger students just continued. Pretty soon after that, the rule was changed. It now said mobile phones are prohibited during lessons, and the students went back to normal. Obviously the friendships that started because of this didn't end though. Edit for all the people who commented that maybe this was the principal's motive all along. We didn't think so. She was always a person who was like, we didn't need technology when we were young, so you don't need it either. Also, she definitely wasn't someone who was concerned for the well-being of students, teachers and staff, and had accepted the job mostly because it raised her pay significantly. TLDR school prohibits phones on school grounds during school hours for year 5-9. We won. Making all the trouble we could by not having our phones. 2. Stretched out our arms over the border of the school grounds so our phones are outside of it. 3. Take every other electric device that's not a phone to school. 4. Just all bring Nintendos and play Mario Kart with almost all the students of years 5-9. School changes the rule to no phones during lessons. Teacher says I can't use Java to write an Android app? Okay then. This might also be eligible for our Petty Revenge post or maybe another subreddit. Let me know in the comments. Before getting into the MC, there's a bit of backstory here. During my sophomore year of high school, I took a dual credit Visual Basic programming class for funsies, and I enjoyed it so much. I decided then and there that my major was going to be directly related to computer programming. So when my high school counselor told me they were offering an AP computer science class during junior year, I signed up immediately, only to be told a few months later that there wasn't enough student interest. I was bummed, but they told me to wait until the next year. I did. And they cancelled the class again for the same reason. Instead, they decided to offer a computer science principles class, which would be in beta, would be targeted at all high schoolers as a sort of intro to CS course, and would eventually become an AP class, they hoped. I was skeptical, but I figured another programming class wouldn't hurt. Enter my first day of senior year 2014. I attended this class, and realized that the instructor is pretty brand new to teaching high school students. It's his first year in the district. He's a passive-aggressive man, but he has enough experience from the field that I figured I would have to learn at least 1 or 2 things from his lectures. Besides, I wanted to get as many scholarships as I was eligible for, so if I gave him the benefit of the doubt, maybe he'd be a useful contact for me, right? So we became friends, in that I would try to help the other students try to connect with his class. Most of them didn't care, they got thrown in just because someone wanted to make up numbers. And in return he'd try to talk to me a bit more about the ever-developing field of CS. But during that first semester, the only concept I ever learned was abstraction, as I knew everything else from my Visual Basic class. So it was mostly a waste of time for me, but I really tried to stick it out and help this teacher where I could. Towards the end, we finally stopped talking about control structures and pseudocode and get to using the SNAT language, which was useful for some people in the class, but for most, they weren't really excited about it. I wasn't too keen on using it myself, but I figured it was a useful illustration for his lessons. Still, I tried to keep everyone on the same page. Then came the second semester, and the teacher announces that we would be building an Android mobile app for our semester-long project. I was thrilled, because I would get to really code something awesome again. So on the sheet of paper he had us write our grand idea on, I scribbled out that I wanted to create a music visualizer that would change both foreground and background colors and movement speed based on BPM. And that the user would be able to change settings inside the app, etc. And then he mentioned that we were only going to use the MIT App Inventor 2 software to create this app, and upon his demonstration, my hopes sank. It was essentially the Snap language, a drag and drop language hosted on a website with a few extra flares, but it was nowhere close to the power, flexibility, and overall ability to use the coding skills that I'd learned in Visual Basic. He also said that we'd be doing checkups every week to see how our progress was going, etc. This piece will be slightly important to note. So I asked him after class, listen, teacher's name, you know that I could do much more than this website provides. You've seen my work, you know I took Visual Basic, please let me write my app in a language that I could use in the future, like Java? And for whatever reason, maybe he didn't want to play favorites? Maybe he wanted to set his foot down. He said, sorry, Jack Knock, but I want everyone here to use this software to make this app. I smiled and said, okay, because in that moment, he lost what respect my somewhat introverted, yet overly edgy teenage self had held for him. Cue the MC. From that point on, I went from being his star student to just giving my bare minimum in class every day. I went from trying to keep his students focused in class to using the very Google Docs page he was teaching us on to help host a giant group chat where we essentially disregarded everything he was saying. But I was still determined to be an A student that year, so I did everything I was absolutely required to, no less, no more. Thus, as his specifications for the app were very minimal, during every checkup I would intentionally degrade my app's hypothetical functionality by saying things like, well, you know, I really thought long and hard about adding music, but the app just didn't seem to function appropriately, and all the necessary technobabble that drew a pained look from my instructor. After all, it was completely within his guidelines for me to continue to remove things that weren't working from my app, but the truth was, I spent maybe 10 minutes in total actually testing the items I knew I wasn't going to have in the final build. This happened every week, to his increasing dismay. I enjoyed myself. Him, not so much. About 2 weeks before the deadline to present my app, he had enough of my shenanigans and announces that we had to finalize the plans for our projects. So I start helping other people with their code, which was me leaving my station to fix someone's broken puzzle piece, and then casually chat with them for about 10 minutes. The teacher picked up on this and had me stay at my station. Fine. I start doing homework for more important classes while waiting for the class period to end, no big deal. About 1 week before the deadline, I actually start working on my app, now entitled Simple is Better, as a nod or middle finger, depending on your perspective, to the only things I learned from his class, the concept of abstraction and my feelings about using this dumbed down software. It was essentially a cookie clicker game clone, with a diamond as the cookie to click. The goal was to unlock about 7 different backgrounds. A far cry from my original idea, but I used what I was given. He was visibly frustrated with my project's new mission, as he expected more from me than what boiled down to a splash screen that led to a loop, with pictures. I just smiled, and said, okay. The presentation day comes, and I double checked my work, cracked my fingers, and downloaded the .apk file for the app. Our software didn't allow you to go backwards from this stage, so it was essentially a sealed deal. Now when it came to presentation, we had test devices, a series of LG Volt devices that couldn't leave the room that we were supposed to run our app on. Not only did my app run on those, the app ran smoothly on my personal device, a Huawei Prism. So I was set, and in my smug satisfaction, I let the others in the class present first. To my teacher's quiet horror, none of the other classmates were able to successfully run their app. Some crashed on launch, some had a black screen, and some were stuck showing the code they couldn't get to run. And for the last but not least approach, I walked up, presented my app on both my test and personal phones, and my instructor had no choice but to give me the A I needed to complete my master collection of A's that year. As he couldn't afford to grade me and everyone else harshly, it was his first year, after all. We haven't talked since that day. Rumor is, he no longer works at that district, and I now wish I gave him less grief over something so small. But that's what happens when passive aggressiveness meets aggressively passive, I suppose. TLDR, my teacher didn't allow me to be an overachiever in his class, so I used approximately 2% of my energy to still give him a better final project than everyone else in the class. Edit: if this post hits 1k likes, I'll post a link to the .apk file so you too can experience my instructor's disappointment firsthand.